So you found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Today we're looking at a little interview from the Institute for Creation Research. Trey, the host for these, is going to interview Jeffery Tomkins, yes, the PhD creationist, who's so incompetent he can't weight data or reliably add three-digit numbers. But they are not going to talk genetics, which is Tomkins' alleged specialty. Instead, they're going to uncover the secrets of Earth's oceans. I am not well qualified for that, though, so instead of me, I'm going to hand it over to my good friend Beryl of Vendor, who currently lives under the sea at an undisclosed location. Before I do, though, please check to see if you're subscribed, and if you're not, why not fix that and turn on all notifications? While you're doing that, if you could please also like the video, it would be greatly appreciated. Growing a channel isn't easy, and YouTube doesn't like to help much unless I get likes and subscriptions. Anyway, here's Beryl. Hello, Dapper's audience. As he said, I am Beryl of Vendor. Since I live under the ocean now, he figured I would be a good one to talk about the whole thing. Well, let us see what Trey and Jeffrey have for us.
I'm your host, Trey, and I have with me today ICR's geneticist, Dr. Tomkins. Thank you for being here.
It's great to be here, and it's cool to talk about something besides genetics.
Perhaps that is because Jeff himself knows how bad he is at talking about that.
Yeah, well, you are a geneticist, so...
At best, I would say that he is a former geneticist. Near as I can tell from Google Scholar, his name has not appeared in the list of authors in a peer-reviewed paper since widespread lateral gene transfer from intracellular bacteria to multicellular eukaryotes published in Science in 2007. Ironically, the paper's abstract ends with, quote, providing a mechanism for the acquisition of new genes and functions, end quote. So I am not sure just how much involvement he had in it, given that it seems to directly contradict his creationist views. It has been about 17 Earth years since his last real publication, so it seems a stretch to call him a geneticist at this point.
That's what you get. You kind of pigeonholed yourself there, but we'll let you talk about something else just as once.
I have lots of friends that are geologists.
That's true. That's true.
Timothy Clary is the house geologist at the Institute for Creation Research, and from what I can tell, he has not published a real work since 2012. As far as I am concerned, that also puts him in the former scientist category. And look, there is nothing wrong with being a former scientist. There is something wrong with pretending you are a scientist when that has not been true for over an Earth decade.
Okay, well, then let's get to it. Today we're going to talk about the young ocean, or rather how the ocean points to a young Earth.
It really does not.
And I think that a lot of people, when they think about the ocean, they kind of think about the creatures in the ocean.
Well, that is flattering.
We're going to be talking about the ocean itself as an environment, sediment, etc., all that jazz.
Oh.
So let's start with what we do know. Let's start with the basics.
I suppose that is also acceptable.
Over 70% of the Earth's surface is covered in water, and most of that's in the oceans.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
That's your pop quiz for the day. Do you know exactly what percent it is?
It changes moment to moment with things like ice at the poles melting, subduction, erosion, and uplift. It is usually about 71% though.
No, I don't.
Okay. All right. Well, me either. I said over 70. So there you go.
Trey is technically correct.
The best kind of correct.
I see this question a lot, particularly in our comment section in YouTube. And people are like, well, if the Earth flooded, where did all the water go? That's something that we're going to discuss today. So if you have that question, you stick around.
It is not my most serious question for the people who want to pretend that the Genesis flood myth is historical, but it is one of the questions I have for them. The problem is that it would take more than double the water currently in the ocean to flood the whole world as it is now. There simply does not seem to be enough water to cover the already extremely low relief globe. Remember, the bumpiness of the Earth is far less than that of a pool ball, which for all practical purposes is completely smooth. Creationists like to propose that it was even smoother in the past, but then that brings up the problem of where was the water before the flood?
All right, so uniformitarians believe that the current oceans are over 200 million years old,
Right.
which is really, really old.
It is odd, but it is also far too young. I have no idea where he is getting this information. Oceans, as such, have been around on Earth for almost 4 billion years by most estimates, and the Pacific Ocean in particular is some 750 million years old, since it is a direct continuation of the Panthalastic Ocean that existed prior to the breakup of Eugenia, the supercontinent before Pangaea. The Atlantic is far younger, being about 150 million years old, since it only started forming in the Jurassic period as the supercontinent of Pangaea broke up. The Indian Ocean formed at a similar time, so while some individual oceans are about 200 million years old, the oldest is far older, and oceans have been around continuously on Earth for more like 3.8 billion years.
If the Earth is as old as these evolutionists believe,
As the evidence indicates.
as these evolutionary uniformitarian geologists, etc.,
I cannot imagine anyone calling themselves an evolutionary uniformitarian geologist. For one thing, geologists do not tend to care very much at all about evolution.
then the biblical account cannot only be questioned, it can be pretty much discarded.
I did not say it, he did.
If the oceans are 200 million years old,
They are in fact approximately 19 times older.
and we of course believe that Noah's flood occurred somewhere around 4,500 years ago, those two numbers don't align.
And since one of those numbers is based on science and one is based on mythology, when assessing which one actually occurred in the past, you should accept the evidence-based number, not the mythology-based number.
But evidence in the ocean supports a young Earth, not some notion of 200 million years. So
That would be a world first, if true.
Well, you know what's really interesting is that before radiometric dating was utilized on igneous rocks to get these dates in the billions of years.
In other words, before we had as much evidence and knowledge as we do now. This is like appealing to biology from before Louis Pasteur falsified spontaneous generation, or astronomy from before the Copernican revolution, when everyone thought that the Earth was stationary and the center of the universe.
The evolutionists actually believed the Earth was much younger. They still believed it was millions of years old.
Well, that depends. Most early geologists, such as Hutton or Lyell, said that the Earth had to be at a minimum millions of years old, but gave no upper age, as there did not seem to be anything that could approach a starting point that they could find. People such as Lord Kelvin, who essentially created the field of thermodynamics, attempted to determine the age of the Earth using heat transfer calculations. But of course, they did not know about radioactivity, which is a source of heat, so their estimates were far too young, but still far too old for young Earth creationism. To return to the geologist, I want to be clear.
Now let me be clear.
The reason they gave these estimates that are far in excess of the age Tomkins would like is because they knew how sedimentation works, and they saw far more sedimentary rocks than could be accounted for in less than millions of years. In other words, they realized that it was physically impossible for the Earth to be only thousands of years old. The fact that we now have confirmed that with other techniques is a strong indication that the Earth simply is not young.
But based on the oceans, that's where they got their data from.
No, it is not, at least not exclusively. Look, here's the first geological map of Great Britain, which was published in 1815 by William Smith. No, my apologies, a different William Smith. It is the first geological map covering a wide area and the first to cover an entire country. One of the things that is very noticeable is that the area where it has data is specifically not the ocean. Instead, all of the data is reserved for Great Britain and the Isle of Man. The first geologists did not get all of their data from the ocean. They got most of it from the land. The main reason for this is that unlike rocks at the bottom of the ocean, the rocks on land can be accessed without significant risk of suffocation. Since, as is likely well known to Dapper's audience, but is apparently less well known to creationists, humans cannot breathe underwater.
Then all of a sudden, radiometric dating became popular, and then they could get billions of years.
Occasionally, most rock that old is long gone, and instead much of the rock available to study is much younger. But there are places with such old rock, especially places like Australia and Canada.
Plugged into their system and make evolution seem even more magical and probable. So,
Geologists are by and large not concerned with the plausibility of anything in biology. Indeed, the very fact that they, for a very long time, would not make age estimates older than the data would indicate before radiometric dating, much to the chagrin of evolutionary biologists, is evidence of this fact. Further, as for the use of the word magic, it is a bit ironic that the man whose preferred model of the world literally involves miracles or it does not work, thinks that making things plausible according to things like the laws of physics and biology is making it more magical. When things can be explained by natural processes, that is the exact opposite of making them more magical.
What's really interesting is that the data we get from the oceans actually points towards a young Earth. And
it is not clear how that could be the case. At best, it would seem that it could point to the young age of the rocks and sediment in the oceans. But just like that pimple on your nose does not need to be as old as you are just to exist, the rocks in the ocean do not need to be as old as the Earth or the oceans as a whole in order for them to exist.
And so that's what's really exciting. And there's multiple angles that we're going to talk about, coming from that perspective.
Such as?
It is interesting that, I mentioned that they believe that the oceans are over 200 million years old, which is old.
It is odd, but I do not know of anyone who thinks that the oceans did not exist prior to 200 million years ago, apart from baby Earth lunatics, which is what Dapper has asked that I call young Earth creationists.
But it's not as old as billions of years old. So it's like, they're like, oh, the oceans are still that old, but the Earth, it's older, right?
No, that is not what's going on. The scientists are saying that the oceans are younger than the Earth, but because the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old and the ocean's some 3.8 billion years old. I really do wish that I knew where they got this 200 million year old ocean talking point.
It's kind of like they're just pushing it back further and further.
Right.
Okay.
I do not even understand what that means. Who is pushing what back? Are geologists pushing the age of the oceans back, or the Earth as a whole? Not really.
Our first topic, we're going to talk about young seafloor sediments.
Here is a thing that is true. Most of the sediment in rivers ends up in the ocean, and ocean rock also tends to be the rock that lasts the shortest time before being subducted into the mantle. This means that we should expect that on average, sediment in the ocean is relatively young.
Go for it.
Yeah, so this is probably one of the best places to start because the seafloor of the oceans is largely what's called the Tejas megasequence.
So I do want to talk about megasequences. This is a term that is only used by creationists, and they simply lie about what the things they are actually talking about indicate. What creationists identify as megasequences are in fact cratonic sequences. Cratonic sequences are the rocks associated with a sea transgression and its retreat. A sea transgression is when the sea rises and so significant portions of the continental crust are underwater long term. Because the sea levels on Earth have waxed and waned over the eons, there are multiple such cratonic sequences, and they are utterly incompatible with a global flood, or even a flood at all. A sea transgression is absolutely not the same thing as a flood. A sea transgression is a very long-term thing that typically lasts tens of billions of years and is a low-energy event. A flood is a short-term event, usually less than a year long, and often only days or even hours long, and it is characteristically a relatively high-energy event. A cratonic sequence is characterized by shallow water, mostly low-energy marine deposition, as well as various associated types of deposition, such as alluvial, followed by an unconformity, which represents the net erosion as the sea retreats. It definitionally really only exists on land, and so saying that the ocean is made up of one of the cratonic sequences is a bit like saying that your pet cat is made of oak tree. Further, despite the claims of creationists to the contrary, it has proven very difficult, if not impossible, to connect the named cratonic sequences of North America to similar sequences on other continents. Hence why the named cratonic sequences all have particularly American names, often derived from indigenous languages, unlike, say, geological time periods, which were usually identified in places like Europe, which is why they have names like the Jurassic period, which is named for the Jura Mountains.
Or it's the upper part of the geological column, which would be the Paleogene and Neogene period. So
that's true.
Why is the ocean so young? And these sediments in evolutionary thinking are less than 66 million years old.
It is because other than the middle of the Pacific Ocean, almost all ocean floor is either actively being made in places like the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, or is currently being subducted, like around the edge of the Pacific, which is the reason for the so-called Ring of Fire around the Pacific. The oceanic crust is made of basalt, which is significantly more dense than the granite that forms the bedrock of continental crust. As a result, the parts of the Earth's crust that are oceanic are thinner and sink into the mantle more easily. This means that rock on the ocean floor cannot persist for as long as continental rock, simply because when continental crust hits ocean crust, the ocean crust sinks and the continental crust sticks around at the surface. As a result, the ocean crust on the whole tends to be much younger than the continental crust, which is essentially never subducted and pushed into the mantle. On that note, Dapper's channel cannot persist for long without your support, so if you are interested, why not consider joining the channel as a member with the Join Channel button. You get early access to videos like this, as well as access to the top secret Discord server that is just for supporters.
And so why is the ocean, roughly 2/3 of it, this Tejas megasequence?
It is not. It cannot be. One, because there is no such thing as a Tejas megasequence. That is the name of a cratonic sequence, and since cratonic sequences are the record of sea transgressions onto continental crust, and the current ocean is almost entirely on oceanic crust, the rocks that make it up is fundamentally not a part of a cratonic sequence. Further, since the Tejas sequence is a North American phenomenon, and North American coasts are not even close to 2/3 of all the coasts in the world, even if the ocean sediment realistically could be part of the Tejas cratonic sequence, it could not be that 2/3 of the ocean sediment is from the Tejas. This is why perhaps the Institute for Creation Research should not have had a former geneticist on to talk about geology.
Or tertiary is what they used to call it, and some geologists still use that term.
Not many, but sure.
So there's two reasons why we have this young ocean, these young ocean sediments. The first one is that during the global flood,
which, remember, cannot account for the cratonic sequences, as floods and sea transgressions are fundamentally different phenomena that leave behind different rocks.
plate tectonics played a very important part.
Yes, to the point that the continents running around at race car speed, as proposed by virtually all flood geologists, would have produced enough heat to boil the oceans many times over, making the flood less a flood and more of an atmospheric ignition apocalypse.
In the flood. And so as the continents were separating during the global flood,
separating from their Rodinia configuration according to most flood models. According to most flood so-called geologists, the pre-flood world was Rodinia, which then split up, came back together into Pangaea, then split up again to get the modern configuration, all in the span of approximately 1 year.
which John Baumgartner, a geophysicist at Los Alamos Labs, has documented with a lot of modeling and geophysics.
Technically, this is true, but it leaves out a lot of important context. First, his plate tectonics modeling software is called Terra, and it was made as part of his PhD dissertation. It is used by others, but not in its original version, because the original version failed to produce the results known in nature and predicted by other models. But it seems Baumgartner may have kept using the known broken version, perhaps because it was more likely to give him the results he needs. Further, to get results compatible with a global flood as he conceives it, he had to do things like ignore the actual changes of crust viscosity with temperature changes, which directly work against his idea of runaway subduction. And he had to assume a thermal diffusivity for the Earth's rock that is about 10,000 times higher than what is known. Further, his model does not take into account anything about the sedimentary rocks of Earth, but when applied to them, it is immediately apparent that this model simply cannot account for the vast array of different types of sedimentary rock formation seen throughout the geological column. Essentially, he started with miracles and got a flood, which was still contradicted by geology. I am not sure how this is supposed to be convincing, and to my knowledge, this model of his has never once passed peer review.
He has shown that plate tectonics moved very rapidly during the flood.
No, he has shown that plate tectonics could move very rapidly during the flood if you assume that the physical characteristics of how heat moves in the rocks of the Earth were different by 4 orders of magnitude. Thermal diffusivity is a measure of the internal heat transfer rate. Basically, if you put a metal spatula on the burner of your stove, how long until the handle is also burning hot? It is defined as the thermal conductivity of the substance divided by the product of its density and specific heat capacity. Thermal conductivity is much like electrical conductivity, except that it measures how fast heat transfers rather than how well electricity transfers. Density is, as you probably know, simply the mass of an object divided by its volume. And specific heat capacity is the amount of thermal energy needed to increase the temperature of a mass of a specific substance by a particular amount. For example, water has a specific heat capacity of 4.184 joules per gram per Kelvin, meaning that it takes 4.184 joules of energy to increase the temperature of 1 gram of water by a single degree Celsius, or by 1 Kelvin, which is the same change in temperature. Thermal diffusivity is a property of a substance that does not simply vary. Under the same conditions, the same substance will always have the same thermal diffusivity, unless the laws of physics change. Since the laws of physics are what they are, Baumgartner's model is physically impossible based on current scientific understanding.
A very rapid plate subduction.
Yes, something no geophysicist has been able to provide a working model for.
So as one plate was moving and subducting underneath another one, the oceans were being created, new seafloor was being made.
Meaning that the seafloor should only be about 4,500 years old, not the tens of thousands of years old that Tomkins has already said the science has found it to be. But I suppose I should not be surprised that the man who cannot figure out high school level statistics cannot understand rock dating either.
The continents separated, and this, if you want to think in geological terms, this began in what we would call the Triassic, and then it progressed all the way up through the Cretaceous.
Meaning that, unlike answers in Genesis, the Institute for Creation Research is apparently not claiming that Rodinia is the pre-flood world. This means that less of the physically impossible catastrophic plate tectonics is needed, but it also means that they have no way to account for the evident existence of Rodinia, a problem that AIG solves by having more of that impossible race car speed tectonics. I would personally suggest that they adopt the AIG idea that the pre-flood world is Rodinia, since the plate tectonics is already physically impossible, and having more of it does not make it more impossible, but it does mean that they do not have to deal with the data indicating Rodinia as a real supercontinent. Maybe they should put me on the Area Advisory Board. I can even take human form for it if my Vendorian anatomy makes them uncomfortable.
And then actually John Baumgartner just gave a recent talk at some scientific meeting showing how the plate movement was actually still going on throughout the end of the flood up into the Cenozoic.
Well, good for him. It's just too bad that he cannot get any of that published in the literature, because, let us remember, his whole model violates the laws of physics.
But during this whole process, new seafloor is being rapidly made as these continents are separating. Mm-hmm. And so that's where we get a lot of the Tejas megasequence.
The Tejas is a sedimentary sequence. That means it was not formed by volcanic activity, meaning that no, this cannot be how the Tejas cratonic sequence was formed. It could be argued that some of the igneous rocks that make up the current ocean floor were formed at the same time as the Tejas was being deposited, but that does not make them part of the Tejas. That is like claiming that some random person must be part of your immediate family because they were born around the same time that your mother was having children.
Another source of the Tejas megasequence was at the end of the global flood as the mountains were raising up and the valleys were sinking, as Psalm 104 says. As these mountains pushed up, all of a sudden that creates this system where water is just pouring rapidly off the continents, and it's carving out canyons like the Grand Canyon.
The problem with this is that the Grand Canyon cannot have been formed by floodwater running off rapidly, as Baumgartner suggests. Nor could it have formed while the sediment making it up was still unlithified, which Baumgartner's model requires, since it takes a known period of time to lithify various sedimentary rocks. Rapid flood runoff creates smooth-sided channels with little to nothing in the way of tributaries, switchbacks, or any other jagged features. And it also tends to result in teardrop-shaped formations where the runoff hits harder material, as well as large-scale ripple marks. None of these features characterize the Grand Canyon or the surrounding Colorado Plateau. Further, unlithified sediments cannot support near vertical surfaces such as we see in the Grand Canyon. Additionally, since this flood runoff was a global event according to Baumgartner, canyons like the Grand Canyon should be found on every continent. Yet, they are not.
We call this late flood runoff, but it's also taking all these sediments and not only pouring them into various places on the continents, like in these big basins, like the Green River Basin and the Powder River Basin near the Rocky Mountains.
The interesting thing about the Green River is that it is a formation of lacustrine rocks. That is, rock laid down in a lake. Now you might wonder how we can know this, and the simple answer is varves. Varves are a kind of layering that occurs within a stratum of rock, which is to say that they are a kind of laminae. Varves are formed in lakes because of seasonal changes in deposition. For example, in the winter, the rivers and streams that feed a lake are usually at a lower volume, so less sediment is deposited. Also, there is virtually no pollen, so little of that is present in the winter either. On the other hand, spring and summer bring more sediment and pollen. These annual cycles produce layers in the lacustrine rock that are quite characteristic. I do wonder how a single event of flood runoff can manage to mimic millennia of seasonal changes right down to the relative pollen count differences. It seems to me that it simply cannot. Of course, creationists could do the sedimentation experiments, but we all know that they will not, since they are loath to ever do any testing that could show them to be wrong on something as fundamental as the flood being the cause for the majority of the sedimentary rocks of the Earth.
but it's also pouring them across the continents, like the Ogallala Formation, which covers multiple states.
The Ogallala Formation shows characteristic signs of being deposited in alluvial fans. That is the area at the mouth of a river where the river fans out and slows down as it hits the ocean. This slowing causes much of the suspended sediment to fall out of the water column and be deposited. Of course, this means that the deposition is considerably lower energy than would be expected by a flood. And also, since it covers such a wide area and alluvial fans take time to grow and move, really, this is a record of the retreat of the Western Interior Seaway, which divided North America during the late Cretaceous. Again, this is not the kind of rock that can be accounted for by a global flood, and simply saying that a model that already breaks the laws of physics requires it to be a flood deposition does not help. It is just another reason to dismiss that model.
And then I'm just using North America as an example here, and as it's pouring off, filling these basins, also putting sediments onto the continent, it's also pouring into places like the Gulf of Mexico.
The sediment in the Gulf of Mexico is easily explained by the action of the rivers that empty into it, such as the Mississippi and Rio Grande.
So the Gulf of Mexico has lots of Tejas megasequence that was from late flood runoff, and
well, it has sediment that was originally deposited by the Western Interior Seaway and was eroded as that inland sea retreated. But since it's not still part of the sedimentary record, as sedimentary rock, then it is not part of the Tejas sequence per se. It is associated with the events that caused the Tejas cratonic sequence, though, so I can at least give Jeff that.
On average, it's about 1,000 feet thick. In some places, it's even 2,000 feet thick.
Dapper has informed me of your Earth game known as Bingo, and that one of the rules is that one marks off a square on their randomly generated Bingo card for when a creationist uses a number that they deem big as an argument that God must have done something. This is called Big Number Therefore God, and if you are playing Bingo, you may now mark that off on your card.
And just to give you a scope of of the immense amount of sediment that was poured into the Gulf of Mexico, it's 40,000 square miles in size. And so this is a huge amount of sediment.
It is only a huge amount of sediment if one can contrast it with a smaller amount of sediment that should be expected if the idea one is putting forth be not true. How much sediment is expected by geologists? Well, it seems like it is simply the amount that we have.
So we get sediments that are very young from this tertiary period in the geological column. We get them from not only seafloor spreading.
Seafloor spreading does not result in sediments, it results in new basalt formation. Basalt is an igneous rock, not a sedimentary rock. This is the kind of question that I am informed is imparted to human larvae while they are still quite young, in what some call middle school.
But also from runoff during the late period of the flood as waters are pouring off the continents and just dumping sediments not only into basins on the continents and other places, but also offshore.
If only that were not contradicted by even the examples Dr. Tomkins himself brings up.
Right. Okay. And just a clarification, we've talked to Dr. Clary at length about...
Dr. Timothy Clary is the former geologist that ICR keeps as a pet, but one they do not clean up after given how much excrement he seems to drop on their website and YouTube channel.
The progressive flood model
Exactly.
that he's worked up. And when you use words, just as a clarification for our viewers and listeners, when you use words like the geologic portions like Cenozoic and stuff like that, we're not referring to the time frame that, uniformitarians
Right.
would ascribe to them. They're just geological markers. And, Dr. Clary and ICR stands by.
All of that basically amounted to them saying that the rocks have names that they do not need to contest in order to claim that the dating of the rocks with these names has been done incorrectly by geologists, and that they are much younger. I do think that this is fair. It certainly makes it easier to talk about geology as well as pseudogeology if the naming conventions are kept the same across the board. One group of people with a consistent naming convention for themselves are Dapper subscribers. So why not take a moment to ensure that you're subscribed to the channel and that you have notifications turned on?
Those were all laid down during the flood.
Exactly. So these are just, units in the flood that were progressively laid down from the beginning of the flood to the very end of the flood, where, water is actually pouring off the continents that are rising up and the mountain ranges that are rising up and is creating that effect.
Well, that is what they would have to be for the flood model to work. But since they cannot be flood deposits based on what is currently known about sedimentation, and that creationists have not bothered to do the work to show how they could be, that conclusion can simply be dismissed out of hand the same way one might dismiss the claim that a human has managed to fly simply by gluing turkey feathers to his arms and flapping mightily, or the claim that someone has created a perpetual motion machine. These are all things that are completely impossible if our understanding of the world is even close to accurate, which it seems to be based on the fact that humans managed to create technology based on that understanding, and the technology functions as expected.
But the problem for evolutionists is they don't understand why the seafloors are so young and why such an immense amount of the seafloor globally is so young.
That is simply not true. The seafloor is the expected age, and seafloor rocks are the rocks that tend to persist as part of the crust of the planet for the shortest time, specifically because they subduct so readily.
And so it's a big conundrum for them, but with flood geology, it perfectly explains what's going on.
It is a conundrum for geologists in much the same way that orbital mechanics are a conundrum for NASA flight planners, in that it is actually well understood, but in specific instances, one still needs to work out exactly what to do or what happened.
Right. Do they even like try to come up with an answer?
Yes.
Or are there any, I guess, like their response to they're just like, we don't know, we're not touching that?
The subduction. The answer is subduction. And of course, the fact that the ocean in some cases is in fact far older than Trey and Tomkins are pretending is the consensus.
Yeah, actually, there aren't a whole lot of answers coming from the evolutionists regarding a lot of these things.
Because remember, this is all predicated on the false idea that geologists think that the ocean crust is all, or nearly all, 200 million years old, and that perhaps that is when the oceans formed in the first place. None of that is actually the consensus in geology.
They document them, but they don't really have a whole lot of answers for it, not a whole lot of agreement among evolutionists that attempt to provide answers.
That can only be a lie or a statement from someone who never bothered to check.
Because it is a mystery
Right.
with the evolutionary model, it doesn't make any sense.
It makes so much sense that I have never even heard anyone talk of it as if it is a problem. The only way it could not make sense is if you happen to think that geologists are unaware of the rock cycle. That is, that rocks form on and unform on Earth, with their material being recycled. Since that is a fairly core part of geology, I do not see why anyone would think that geologists are unaware of it.
And so, of course, from our creationist point of view, it makes total sense. The flood model, the progressive flood model in particular, really fills the void there.
Using physically impossible scenarios to explain something that is already well explained by physically possible processes that these two happen not to like is not what I would call filling the void.
Oh, exactly. And, one thing to keep in mind, too, is that the flood lasted over a year in length, a little over a year.
Not just 40 days and 40 nights.
Not 40 days and 40 nights like people, will often say.
Yeah.
Yes, I am aware. Although at the physically impossible rates of geological and tectonic activity that these two are discussing, would it really matter if the flood were 40 days, 400 days, or 4 days? I would argue that it would not.
And when it comes to the oceans, most of the flood waters came from the oceans.
That is only viable if God multiplied the ocean water, like Jesus multiplying the loaves and fish.
So what's really interesting, if we had absolutely no mountains and the surface of the Earth, which is a sphere.
Which is a sphere.
Clarify that, I'm not a flat earther.
He is not a flat earther because in this instance he allows evidence from science to trump a literal reading of the biblical text, which, at least in the Hebrew scriptures, assume and imply a flat earth resting on pillars surrounded by a cosmic ocean, which is kept out by a solid dome, which has windows or gates to let it in through the precipitation. Tomkins is very selective about his literalism, and he is so based not on some rigorous exegetical framework, but simply because he knows that the Bible is simply wrong when it talks about the shape of the earth and its place in the cosmos. So he simply reinterprets those. For some reason, though, he will not extend that to more of the Bible that contradicts what we know of reality from the scientific evidence. He says that doing so would be to reject the authority of Scripture and bring other parts of it into question, like the resurrection of Jesus. But why does ignoring what the firmament is, or ignoring the foundations of the earth, not bring the reality of the resurrection into doubt, but the old age of the earth does? It seems to me that if one of those is a problem for the veracity of the Bible on the whole, then so too is the other. I would say that the rejection of a flat earth geocentrist cosmology is just as much a threat to the authority of the scriptures as accepting evolution and the age of the earth are. Either both are a problem or neither are. Now, I'm not here to tell you which of those options is correct, but I am here to point out that Tomkins is being inconsistent.
But if it was totally flat, actually the entire Earth would be covered in 8,000 feet of ocean water.
That's a lot.
Well, since Genesis has rivers flowing out of the Garden of Eden, Eden must have been higher than sea level, so there must have been elevation differences before the flood. Further, if the pre-flood world was Pangea, as Tomkins seems to think, that means that the mountains that are now represented in the Atlas Mountains, the Scottish Highlands, and the Appalachian Mountains would have all existed before the flood, and they are currently thought to have been higher than the modern Himalayas at their greatest height. So we have every reason to know that whether or not the flood is true, there was no period of history in which the planet's surface was so low relief as to allow the oceans to flood the whole surface. With apologies to Kevin Costner, there simply has never been enough water on Earth to flood its whole surface. Indeed, even the Genesis account does not say that the water was already on Earth. Rather, it comes from the fountains of the great deep, in Hebrew, the Tehom, and from the floodgates of heaven. The Tehom is the primordial cosmic ocean from which God forms the world in Genesis 1, and it was thought to surround the flat, domed Earth.
And that's a lot. So people ask, well, where did the flood come from? Well, it came from the oceans. Where did it go? Well, it went back into the oceans.
Not according to Genesis. It amazes me how transparently Tomkins and his fellow creationists will cherry-pick from Genesis, while portraying themselves as paragons of letting the Bible speak for itself and accepting biblical authority. Clearly, they have dogmatic beliefs that they hold regardless of what the Bible says, and they very obviously are willing to twist the biblical text to say what they want the text to say.
Especially with the rising and the lowering of the mountains and valleys. Yeah.
Yeah, so...
Something we know for a fact did not start at the base of the Paleozoic, because we have older evidence of topological relief on Earth. At most, new valleys and new mountains could have replaced the older ones, but that does not provide any evidence that the Earth was in any way significantly smoother in the past. On the other hand, the fact that Tomkins is proposing this might indicate something about the smoothness of his gray matter.
And the oceans are amazing. You know, the average depth of the ocean is 2.3 miles.
That's true.
Which is incredible.
Yeah.
It seems very credible to me as someone who lives in the ocean.
There's some deep trenches that are over 6.8 miles deep. And so the ocean is an incredibly vast reservoir of water.
Yes, but that does not make it sufficient to flood the whole planet, such that no land is above the water. Saying how big something is does not make it big enough. For instance, if I tell you that I need a rocket capable of putting 1 metric ton into low Earth orbit, and you go on about how your rocket can lift 650 kilograms into orbit, and that is very impressive, it does not do anything to solve my problem of needing to put 1,000 kilograms into orbit. 650 kilograms is indeed an impressive payload capacity, but it is still too small. Similarly, the ocean is indeed impressively vast on a human scale, but that does not make it more than twice as big as it is, which is what would be needed.
And compared to land, you know, 70% of the Earth is covered by water, and most of it's in the ocean. So,
all but about 3%, and of the remaining water, about 2/3 of that is locked up in the polar ice caps. This leaves about 1% of the Earth's water in fresh water, such as lakes, streams, and rivers.
So that's where the flood came from. That's where the flood went, and the oceans had a major impact in the overall scheme of how the flood worked.
Okay.
But it's not okay. If I tell you I need a cup of flour to make pancakes, but you only give a teaspoon of flour, that does not let me make my pancakes. This is the same thing. The oceans remain of insufficient volume to flood the whole Earth, and pointing out their volume is large when compared to the volume of non-ocean water, or just large in absolute terms, does nothing to solve the problem. The floodwater simply exceeds the amount of water known to exist on Earth.
That does make sense.
Maybe if you use a lot of wishful thinking and no critical thinking.
And when I think about the oceans now, it's honestly, they say we know more about space oftentimes than we know about our own oceans because of how deep and vast it is.
Yeah.
And I guess the pressure.
That is true, but we still know the volume of the ocean. The fact that the seafloor is full of mysterious new life and the occasional resident alien from the Beta Quadrant does not mean that it has a whole lot of extra volume that no one knows about apart from Tomkins and his deplorable ilk.
Yeah.
Well, they're constantly discovering new creatures and new phenomena in the oceans because it's so vast, it's so deep, and it really is kind of a new frontier.
This is true. I mean, humans have not found me yet, although they probably will not, since I tend to turn into a rock when they get close.
Related to that, so we just talked about essentially young seafloor sediments. There's also the aspect of that there aren't enough sediments for an old Earth in the ocean. Like I imagine that if the Earth was as old as they say it is, everything would be just kind of, Earth would be a round ball covered in water because everything would be worn down, right?
Wrong.
There are processes such as subduction that remove sediment from the ocean, and processes such as uplift and volcanic activity, which increase the elevation of the crust. The only way for Earth to wear smooth and be a ball of sediment is for these things to cease. Since they are ongoing and there is evidence of them throughout the geological record, there is no possibility that the Earth could have ever worn smooth. Also, it is important to note that erosion requires an energy gradient provided by gravitational potential energy. The lower the overall relief of a given part of the Earth, the lower the slope of that gradient, and therefore the slower the rate of erosion. That means that as Earth gets smoother, the rate of erosion gets lower, further countering the tendency to become a smooth ball of maximally eroded sediment.
Yeah, and so when I talk about those kind of sediments, I'm not talking about flood sediments because you have wind, you have rain, you have waves hitting all the coastlines, and so the Earth is eroding.
In some places, yes, but not on net globally, because of things like uplift. Right now, as you listen to this, the Himalayas are getting taller.
And it's eroding at a rate that scientists have been able to determine.
Yes, this is true.
And so these kind of sediments actually form mud on the ocean floor.
Okay.
And so what's really interesting is that scientists have determined that about 22 billion cubic feet of mud comes off the continents into the oceans per year.
I will just accept that for now.
That's a lot.
It's a lot of mud.
My understanding is that bingo cards do not have multiple spaces with the same trigger for being filled in, so his repeated use of the big number therefore God argument will not further help those of you playing that game. My apologies. I hope this does not ruin your enjoyment of your game.
And so when you take that into account, the ocean cannot be 200 million years old or it would be completely full of mud.
Except that sediment is pulled down into the mantle when the crust it sits on subducts, so this is not a problem.
In fact, there's places in the ocean where there isn't any new mud whatsoever.
Well, there are places in the ocean that are far away from any significant sediment deposition, and that are in some cases active volcanic hotspots with new basalt forming. So we should expect these places to be more or less free of significant sediment deposition.
And so, the mud comes from the waves hitting the coastline and the wind erodes soil off the continents, dumps it in the oceans.
Nearly all the sediment that gets into the ocean comes from rivers. Direct wave action and windboard sedimentation is a small fraction of it.
Sediments come out of rivers and are dumped into the oceans. And so...
he did get there.
Based on the amount of material that's being put into the oceans that form this layer of mud on top of the flood sediments, there's no way that the oceans could be 200 million years old.
Okay.
It is always amazing the degree to which creationists will simply extrapolate any process into the past at present rates, if doing so will help them, regardless of how much evidence there is that modern rates are variable and contingent. But when scientists do the same thing with things that physically cannot vary in any significant way, such as radiometric decay, they object.
Have uniformitarians tried to explain this away, come up with some sort of mechanism? Where do they think all the mud has gone? Do they say anything about it?
For the fifth time, it is subduction, which is when the crust is pulled into the depths of the earth. If you want to avoid that fate, Dapper can likely prevent it for his Patreon patrons. There is a link in the description for the Patreon if you are interested. It comes with early access and Discord access, just like the memberships.
Yeah, one of the rescue mechanisms that they have is that, based on plate tectonics, the continents are the tectonic plates are still moving a few inches per year, and that is pushing some of this mud into deep ocean trenches.
And into the mantle. Remember, anytime a creationist says rescuing device, what they mean is reason my argument does not work and is stupid.
Well, the fact of the matter is that only accounts for about 1 billion cubic feet of mud per year.
I was about to say,
that's just a fraction of 22 billion cubic feet of mud per year.
Near as I can tell, these are not things that have even been calculated in terms of volume or mass. So I would love a citation for this, but then again, that is a weak rebuttal. So let us see what we can know about this. Multiple studies have indicated that as subduction increases, this causes orogenesis, or mountain building. Remember that the higher the terrain, the faster the erosion is, which means that more subduction means more erosion, which means more deposition, which means that the Earth will reach an equilibrium, because this is a negative feedback loop. A couple papers to look at, which were supplied to me by a professional geologist, are Crustal Redistribution, Crust Mantle Recycling and Phanerozoic Evolution of the Continental Crust by Peter D. Clift et al. From 2009, and Subduction Erosion, Rates, Mechanisms, and its Role in Arc Magmatism, and the Evolution of the Continental Crust and Mantle by Charles R. Stern from 2011. So in the long run, it is simply not physically possible for deposition to greatly exceed subduction when it comes to sediments. Further, since neither I nor the geologists I know of have been able to find any global estimates for the volumetric rate of either process, it seems that the numbers that Tomkins is using were found not in the literature, but rather at the exit end of his digestive tract.
If that actually was the case, and that's never been proved, that's just a rescue.
Just conjecture, yeah.
Yeah, it's conjecture. So,
okay.
Yeah, it is not though. It has been well demonstrated that sediments form lighter magma, which encourages orogenesis. What has not been shown, near as I can tell anywhere, are Tomkins numbers.
fact of the matter is, even with the rescue device of some of this mud being pushed into deep ocean trenches by plate tectonic activity,
And then into the mantle. That is important.
it still doesn't work. It only gets them a fraction of that 22 billion.
Which might have been a problem if Tomkins had bothered to actually cite his sources and tell us how he got those numbers. But since he did not, they are meaningless and very probably made up. Probably by someone other than Tomkins.
And so really what we're looking at from the ocean floor, from 2 points of view, we're seeing that really uniformitarian.
Why is he so red? That seems unnatural. Does ICR simply not have the ability to color correct their footage?
Thinking doesn't have they don't have an answer for what we see.
Well, they do have an answer for what is seen, but not for the unsourced nonsense of young Earth creationists.
But from our young Earth creation flood
Right.
model, and again, it does it comes back to the flood, which if at one point the entire Earth was covered with floodwaters, it would make sense that the oceans would indicate that, right?
It does make sense, and they did not indicate this. And this is precluded by the sedimentation both in the ocean and on land.
Right.
Okay.
And so, these are just practical ways to measure what's going on in the oceans. This isn't, widely theoretical stuff. I mean, the amount of material that's deposited in the ocean, erosion, and things like that, the fact the ocean floors are very young. I mean, this is just, the way it is.
Yeah.
And, I mean,
Very empirical.
right.
Yeah.
It's very empirical. Exactly.
Odd then that neither I nor my geologist contacts can find his numbers anywhere. If it is empirical, that generally means that there are numbers associated with the data, and yet they seem not to exist outside of creationist echo chambers.
And so another thing kind of related to the whole plate tectonics issue is, so you've got basically one plate subducting underneath another one.
Yes, that is what tends to happen when ocean crust hits continental crust.
And during the flood, that happened very quickly.
Well, only if you pretend that the Earth has different physical and chemical properties than it is known to have.
And so basically you had the plate that would be going underneath another one moving very quickly and emplacing that thick material deep within, beyond the crust, even into the upper part of the mantle, which is below the crust.
Right.
It is impossible for a plate to go under another plate without going into the mantle, because the mantle is directly below the crust.
Okay.
And so what's really interesting is just a couple of years ago, evolutionists or geologists, actually measured with seismic tomography the amount of heat in these deep plates that were way deep. And in fact, these plates are 60 miles thick.
Wow.
And go up to 900 miles below the surface of the ocean. And they found out that they were very cold.
So this is a bit of a problem for young Earth creationists, not scientists. For one thing, just Baumgartner's own estimates are that his runaway subduction model would produce some 10 to the 28th joules, or about the energy of a trillion with a T, hydrogen bombs, which I am given to understand are weapons humans think of as particularly destructive. But there are many even bigger sources of heat that had to occur during the flood. such as the hardening of all the Phanerozoic lava, the lithification of essentially all biogenic limestone, at least 500 million years of radioactive decay, and all the bolide impacts from the Cambrian on up. This is enough to turn the crust of the Earth not to lava, but to vapor many times over. Nothing should be cool if the flood happened. The very fact that there is something in the mantle that can be called cold, even relatively, is on its own a falsification of the flood. Further, the slab should take on average about 110 million years to reach thermodynamic equilibrium with the mantle. So unless it has been 110 million years since the last episode of subduction, there will be cold slabs of crust material from the ocean detectable in the mantle.
In temperature, well, that doesn't make any sense because if the Earth is billions of years old,
I mean,
and these
it would've
plates
heated
have
up,
these
right?
plates have been moving at only a couple inches per year over
Yeah.
that period of time. They should not be cold. They should be really warm.
They are, though. They are just not as hot as the surrounding mantle.
Because once you get into the mantle, that whole area there where it connects or interfaces with the crust is very warm, very hot.
That's true.
In other words, everything should have been equilibrated to the same temperature if these slabs were in fact, millions upon millions of years old.
Someone did not check the paper's slab temperature evolution over the lifetime of a subduction zone by A.F. Holt and C.V. Condit, 2021, plus just the approximate diffusivity of the Earth's crust and the thickness of the basaltic ocean crust is enough to figure out about how many millions of years it would take, and it is about 110. That means that the crust material that was subducting in the Albian stage of the early Cretaceous would just now be reaching thermal equilibrium. But hey, that is just math and physics. Who cares about those things? Certainly not young Earth creationists, since their whole flood model depends on breaking numerous laws of physics.
But why are they so cold? Well, because based on the flood model, they were pushed deep into the Earth's crust and into the top part of the mantle.
While experiencing a thermal flux high enough to turn them into plasma. Until creationists solve the heat problem, they do not get to use anything that is called cold as evidence for their model, even if it did contradict mainstream models, which it does not.
Only a little over 4,000 years ago, so that's why.
Very quickly, too. Yeah.
Yes, they were emplaced very quickly, only a little over 4,000 years ago. That's why they are so cold, and they never have equilibrated to the hot temperature of the mantle and the crust surrounding them.
Okay.
Of course, the problem is that just getting them to move that fast requires the energy equivalent of 1 trillion hydrogen bombs. So if we assume that the flood was 371 days long, as most young Earth creationists would tell us, and we assume 510.1 million square kilometers for the surface area of the Earth, every square kilometer was experiencing the equivalent of over 5.25 hydrogen bombs per day of added heat from Baumgartner's plate tectonics. Nothing will be cold under these conditions, and remember, the heat just from Baumgartner's rapid plate movements is not even close to the majority of the heat being released, according to the flood models.
I mean, that definitely makes sense. And I think that's not even...
And that's another piece of empirical, data that just, how do you explain that with deep time? You can't.
You can't.
You can't, unless you can do high school level algebra and know what formulas to use. Then it becomes trivially easy to explain in just one equation. Time equals the square of the relevant linear extent, in this case thickness, about 60 kilometers, divided by the diffusivity of the rock, about 10 to the negative 6th meters per second, which yields about 3 times 10 to the 15th seconds, or about 110 million years. I do not know about you watching this, but that seems like a perfectly reasonable old Earth compatible calculation, one that it would seem Tomkins never bothered to do.
Yeah, it's like the evidence is just like is mounting.
What evidence?
We do, and because I read all the comments.
Not even Dapper reads all the comments, although he does try to read as many as he can.
They're kind of on my mind right now as
Sure.
I think about them, because I'm like, oh, what are people going to say when we say this on the podcast? There's a little look behind the curtain. We know that there are going to be people who, we have detractors for sure.
If I were in human form, I assure you, I would be blushing right now.
And one of the things they say is like, well, you can't
Do math? Well, we already knew that about Tomkins.
prove that God exists or that the flood happened. And it's like, well,
Maybe some people would say that, but none of them would be me. I do not care about humans proving one of their gods to be true, and the flood has already been falsified thousands of times over.
No, not in the way that would satisfy them.
Right.
Even if we could, it still wouldn't matter.
It would certainly matter to me, and it would matter to Dapper. Dapper is a former young Earth creationist. If the idea could actually be shown to be true, then both of us would be happy to accept flood geology.
But there's like so much empirical, just like numbers evidence that their model also.
The only numbers in this that I have actually been able to source have been no problem at all for the great antiquity of the planet.
It's like
Well, it's like,
it
where
doesn't
does the
work.
data? Yeah, where does the data? You know, we're looking at the same data.
Right.
We are not. As has already been extensively documented in The Rocks Were There, Volume 1, by authors R.J. Downard and Jackson Wheat, creationists routinely ignore approximately 90% of all relevant data in any field on which they bother to comment. Creationists are talking about a tiny fraction of the data. Scientists have to deal with all of it.
Whether we're a creationist or an evolutionist, we're looking at the same data. So which model does the data fit?
Mm-hmm.
The one used by real scientists, the ones who do not routinely ignore the data, i.e. the creationists and other pseudoscientists.
Well, obviously, when we look at the natural world, the oceans and the various features in the geological column, it all points to what the Bible describes as a global flood.
You serious?
About 4,500 years ago.
Ah yes, while the Egyptian civilization was thriving, while not noticing that they were being inundated in a global flood.
And so that's where the data lines up. That's the model that it fits best.
It is unfortunate that no such data has been provided thus far.
And it doesn't fit this model of millions of years or billions of years of deep time.
Yes, it does.
And honestly, when I think about that, it kind of blows my mind that we still there's this aspect of why do you not believe in real science? Because like the numbers that we're putting forth, it's like this is real science. What's your explanation, right? Yeah.
Except that is not real science, because the numbers preclude young Earth creationism in hundreds of ways, and young Earth creationists have to literally make up their own numbers to get their ideas to work. And even then, they still tend to violate the laws of physics. But it is with that thought that I shall leave you for now. Dapper has asked that I encourage you to like this video if you enjoyed it, and if you did not, to dislike it. He has also asked that you comment your thoughts about this video, and subscribe if you have not already done so. Additionally, please use the bell icon to turn on all notifications so that YouTube will send you notifications when Dapper's channel has new content, at least about 10% of the time. Thank you for watching. I am Beryl of Vendor. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Benthoven, Philravara, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Eleron Teller, Horseflesh, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostek Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabdy Babdy, Sphincter of Doom, Wallace, John Ackerman, Eta V, and Strawberry Vein. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.